I will never substitute in a small town again. I was a substitute teacher in a small town called Bintan, Iowa. Bintan is one of those towns where there's only a couple of traffic lights, a few general stores, and where everyone knows everyone. Naturally, people reacted strangely to me because I was an outsider. This didn't bother me though. I only moved to this town because my grandmother was old and sick, and she asked me to come live with her, being that I was her only living relative. We never really had that much interaction, so for me, it was a random pleasant surprise that she would even consider me to come stay and help her. My mother died when I was a baby, leaving me to be raised by my father for the majority of my life. When I was 19, in college, my father went on a business trip, and that was the last anyone had ever heard of him. It's still a missing persons case to this day. No aunts, no uncles, no cousins, so it was only me. I didn't mind it either, because her house was huge and she had a few fancy cars and guns that would keep me occupied whenever I got bored. And on top of that, the few times in my life when I did meet her, she was the sweetest old lady. The outside world will refer to this town as a hick town in Iowa, but for me, it was my escape. Recently, I broke up with my girlfriend, and this space and freedom that this small town was offering me was my perfect opportunity to start over. I decided that all of my years of college should finally go to use, and I should get a real job, as that was one of the reasons why my ex was now my ex. Almost immediately after filling out a few applications to work at some of the local businesses in town, I got a substitute teaching opportunity at the town's middle school. I was filled with excitement, but also overtaken by a weird feeling of apprehension. That feeling you get when your conscience is screaming at you not to make the bad decision. I wish I would have listened. Instead, I thought about maybe beginning a career as a teacher, and that by accepting this substitute job, I would be taking my first steps into being a real adult. There was no interview process, just a phone call. A scratchy old voice on the other end of the phone simply said,
"Thanks for applying, Daniel. We would like you to start as soon as possible. Please call me at 555-6565 if you have any questions. Thank you."
As soon as the phone hung up, I received a text message with details about my start date and the location of the school. There was no description of what I'd be doing or which subject I would be teaching. Just a start date and the location of the school. Thinking that this position was lacking in details, I decided to call back the number that just called me. It went straight to voicemail 3 times. And on the 3rd time, I left a voicemail exclaiming that I was a little bit confused about the job details and I would love more information about the position, but nonetheless, I'll be there tomorrow. I hung up the phone feeling anxious to start my new job. Even more so, I was excited to start earning money for my future. That mix of excitement and anxiety kept me up all night thinking about what I would encounter as a teacher, especially since I gave my teachers hell coming up through middle school. As I lay in bed, mind racing, I could see the sunlight starting to peak above the horizon in the distance, which meant that I would have to start my first day of my new job with absolutely no sleep. Fuck! I rushed out of the bed, got dressed, kissed my grandmother goodbye, letting her know I should be back before the sun goes down this evening, then scrambled out the house. I typed the address from the text message into my GPS, wondering why I hadn't received a call or a text back from the voice message I left. Maybe they got busy, is what I told myself, as not to think about it too hard. The GPS said that the destination was 10 minutes from where my grandmother's house was. This was odd, because if you drive 10 minutes in any direction in this town, you would be out of this town and in some unclaimed backcountry. Regardless, I made the trip and pulled up to a creaky old wooden cabin that had not aged well with time. It had holes in the roof, and some of the dusty glass windows were broken. It was a building shrouded by trees and had an old beat-up sign in the front that read, Alfred Weatherby Middle School, established in 1901. There were a few cars parked in a dirt parking lot, but it seemed that there were no kids at the school yet. I couldn't even see any movement from my limited view through the schoolhouse windows. I parked my car and I approached the front door. As I approached, I heard adults chanting, but couldn't make out exactly what they were saying. They could have been saying the Pledge of Allegiance or a prayer, for all I know, but honestly I couldn't tell, so I just brushed it off and opened up the door. To my surprise, there was a group of adults. The women in white dresses and the men in button-up shirts with suspenders, standing around in a circle in a big room with no furniture other than a beautiful rug on the ground and a single chair. There was a picture on the wall of ABCs, but other than that, the walls were bare as well. Their focus shifted entirely to me when I burst through the door. That same scratchy voice from the phone spoke out amongst them. It was an older, pale woman, and she said,
You must be Daniel. I'm sorry I didn't return your call last night. We had a staff meeting and I got busy. My name is Dorothy Weatherby, and I'm the headmaster here. Thank you for filling out this position. We had an unfortunate absence of one of our most beloved teachers, Mr. Munoz. This is our staff, and our students should be arriving soon.
Miss Weatherby gestured to the staff, and they dryly waved at me like the emotions had been sucked out of their souls. Then she made a gesture to follow her.
Daniel, you will be teaching math class, replacing Mr. Munoz due to his unfortunate absence.
She walked me down an old dusty hallway that had wooden doors on each side and a really creaky wooden floor, all the way back to a small room with 7 desks set up in a semicircle. There were books piled up in the corners, looking like they hadn't been used in decades due to the thick layer of dust that blanketed them. Miss Weatherby said,
I'll be in the room 2 doors down if you need me.
She walked out the room, and when she did, a really loud bell started ringing. Now, this wasn't a bell like an intercom system like in every other school across America, but an old school, real deal, Liberty Bell looking bell. And as the bell sounded, I looked out the dusty window to see a line of children, all wearing animal masks, slowly walking by and into the building. Weird, I thought. But what hasn't been weird about this day so far? I estimated about 20 children in total, and they all quietly and eerily walked into the main room and sat in a circle on the beautiful rug, surrounded by the bare wood floor. Miss Weatherby walked into the middle of their circle and said,
Welcome, children. You all look so amazing in your animal masks to celebrate the spring equinox. I want you to meet the new substitute teacher replacing Mr. Munoz, Daniel. Everyone say hello, Mr. Daniel.
And in unison, the kids let out a dry, emotionless, really creepy,
Hi, Mr. Daniel.
I waved at the eerie-looking kids still wearing their animal masks. There was a goat, a bird, a bear, a dog, a cat, a bull, and so many other kinds of masks. These masks were not just plastic children's masks like I would have expected them to be, but upon further inspection, the masks were made of porcelain and looked pretty expensive due to the vintage nature of them. My assignment for the day was to teach basic math, like addition and subtraction to students who struggled with math. Instead of switching periods like a normal middle school, this school would focus on one subject per day. There were 6 kids in my class, a bear, a ram, a horse, a deer, and a bird, and then there was one child I must have overlooked initially, because this child wasn't wearing a mask. He had sloppy brown hair, and looked like he came from a struggling household, being that his clothes had holes in it and his shoes were more worn than any other child in the classroom. I was given a classroom roster to take the role. Sally? Here. Jason? Here. Derek? Here. Anders? Here. Emily? Here. Silas? Silas? He doesn't talk that much, but that's Silas. The children pointed at a kid without a mask. Instead of being responsive, he was drawing on a sheet of paper. Curious, I walked over to Silas to see what he was drawing. When I got close to his desk, he stopped drawing and looked straight up at me through my soul with the most piercing stare that I've ever seen. I couldn't really make out what was on his paper because I didn't want to bother him too long, but what I saw looked like fire.
Okay, class. My name is Mr. Daniel. I'll be your temporary math teacher due to Mr. Munoz's absence. According to the notes he left behind, you're supposed to be learning about the order of operations.
They took off their mask and pulled out their notes. I was expecting disfigured-looking faces to appear from behind these creepy masks, but all these kids looked pretty normal. I began going over the lesson plans with no problem up until lunch.
Get your things ready for lunch. We're going to the main room to eat.
I instructed the kids. They got their lunch boxes and lined up at the door. Silas was in the back of the line, and oddly, still hadn't said anything the entire day. As the kids were exiting to go to the area in the main room designated for lunch, Silas slipped me a folded sheet of paper. I put it into my pocket, and Miss Weatherby walked into the room and said,
Daniel, you can take a lunch break now. We will watch over the kids during lunch. How did Silas do?
Thank you. Silas did not say anything the whole day,
I responded.
Yeah, he's like that. Don't take it personal, Daniel. Enjoy your break.
As she walked away, I pulled the paper Silas had slipped me out of my pocket and unfolded it. To my horror, there was a picture of a man tied to a stake on fire, surrounded by little animal-human hybrid creatures all holding hands. Immediately, I had that gut-wrenching feeling that something was wrong, but I tried to brush it off as Silas being more than a little weird. I went to my car and I started eating the PBJ that I packed for lunch the previous night. I pulled out my phone and I started watching Secure Team on YouTube. I love that channel. The connection was pretty shitty, so I gave up on that idea quickly. I glanced up as I put my phone away, and I saw Silas standing at the tree line behind the school, talking to what appeared to be an adult. This was alarming to me, because all the adults were inside monitoring the children for lunch. However, I could barely make out the silhouette of the adult figure because he was shrouded in the trees. But I could tell it was a male, and he looked massive, like inhumanly massive. I couldn't really tell, but it looked like he had an animal mask on, just like the kids. I slowly got out of my car and I yelled, "Silas!" Silas looked back, and as he did, the man from the tree snatched Silas into the wooded area out of my view with a speed that was unreal. I panicked. Immediately, and quite involuntarily, I began running after him, yelling his name. Sprinting beyond the tree line and into the forest, I could see the huge stature of the man way far in the distance. There's no way he could have gotten that far in this little bit of time. But regardless, I continued to chase because I was responsible for this child today, and I didn't want Silas to get hurt in any kind of way. After about 100 yards, I lost sight of the man and Silas, but I was in a clearing, and what I saw terrified me. I saw a pile of burnt wood and a stake sticking out in the middle. This instantly made me think of the picture that Silas handed me before he was abducted. "Fuck this!" I yelled, as I turned around and ran in the direction I came. Before long, I could see the school through the brush of the forest, and instead of running to the school, I headed straight for my car. I jumped inside the front seat and started at my car, not hesitating at all to throw my car into reverse and start backing out of that dusty parking spot. Upon looking into the rearview mirror, I let out a gasp so intense that I almost choked. It was Mrs. Weatherby. she was just standing there.
Where are you going? The kids were waiting on you.
She shouted. She looked really angry and disappointed at the same time. I rolled my window down and yelled to her,
I have an emergency with my grandma, and I have to leave right now. I'm sorry. I hope I didn't inconvenience you.
She said nothing, and she stepped aside. Her countenance went from angry to very calm as she just stood there staring at me with a gentle but sinister grin. I'm sure with the speed that I left that place, I kicked up all kinds of dirt on her with my tires, but I was not going to look back. In fact, as I was driving, I vowed to myself that I would never go to the outskirts of town again. Instead of going straight back home, I went to a local coffee shop just to clear my mind. Plus, I didn't want to alert my grandma about coming home too soon. So for an hour, I slowly sipped on my cappuccino and tried to sort out all the things that I just witnessed. The more I tried to piece it together, the more confused I became. Eventually, I gave up, and I decided to just forget about it and make sure no psychos were anywhere near my grandmother's house. So I pulled into the driveway, and everything was peaceful just as it was when I left. A small grin of satisfaction came across my face because I felt like I was in a force field of safety at this house. I wish I could say the story ended here, but there's more. I got out of my car, and I went into the front door.
Granny,
Just as I said that, I heard a sharp, high-pitched ringing in my ears, and my vision was completely whited out. Simultaneously, I felt a really sharp pain in the back of my head as I uncontrollably fell to the hardwood floor. Unconscious for God knows how long, I awoke to that same chanting. The same chanting I heard when I walked into that creepy school building. And as I regained my vision, I noticed that I was, in fact, in that creepy school building, surrounded by all the teachers, all chanting unrecognizable words in unison. I was unable to move or speak, as they had me bound by thick rope with duct tape covering my mouth. Ice ran through my veins, and my heart was beating irregularly out of fear. Mrs. Weatherby spoke up.
You see, Daniel, many years ago, my father built this school, and me and my sister have had to look after it when he passed. However, he wasn't ready to pass, and he had more plans for this glorious institution. We prayed to God to have his soul back to finish what he had started, but we received no answer. So we prayed to the devil, and instantly we were told that he would be allowed amongst the living so long as we provide 2 sacrifices a year. Mr. Munoz was the first of this year, and thanks to the help of my sister, you will be the second.
Although terrified, I was curious as to what she meant by her sister. But just as that thought entered my mind, my grandmother entered the room. She walked up to Miss Weatherby and said,
Father said everything is ready now.
Miss Weatherby said,
Perfect.
Then she took a cloth and held it to my nose, and again I found myself unconscious. I awoke, and this time it was nighttime and I was outside. Still unable to move, I found myself tied up to a stake in the woods that I saw earlier. They were going to sacrifice me. My heart was beating 100 times per second as I looked around for a way out of this situation. I was surrounded by burnt pieces of wood and those god-awful children in those horrifying animal masks singing a song as they joined hands in a circle. It looked as if the masks were melting into the children's faces as they all started looking deformed. The faculty and Miss Weatherby held torches in their hands, and they now were also wearing animal masks. Mrs. Weatherby's mask was a goat. My grandmother began speaking.
Tonight, we have a bloodline sacrifice, so we shall not need to sacrifice for another 5 years to Father. Sing, my father's children, and celebrate as we send another child into the light. Mercy, Father, your light shines so bright. With this sacrifice, I hope it is sufficient in bringing you life.
The mutant children began singing louder when all of a sudden, a deep, terrifying, gut-wrenching growl came from the woods. It sounded like a bear and a pit bull and a lion growled at the same time. Immediately, everything fell dead silent. I started literally trembling with fear and sweating profusely from every pore in my body. The trees in the woods were moving, and the only sound that could be heard was a heavy breathing mixed with grunts and wheezing from whatever was in the woods that was getting closer by the second. A horrid stench filled the air, comparable to rotting dead animal flesh mixed with sewage. And as the smell overtook the air, I could see the same silhouette of the huge man from earlier, except this time it looked more menacing and way bigger than I originally thought. What emerged from the woods was the single most disturbing thing that I had ever seen in my life. He, or it rather, had a head of a ram but the jaw of a bear. The torso was that of like a muscular man, but the arms were different. It had one long human arm with a human hand, but on the other arm was just a growth of slimy flesh. The closest thing I could compare it to is like a tentacle. It stood on two cow or bull-looking legs with hooves at the feet. My brain could not fathom the sight of what I was seeing in front of me. This was a collection of human and animal parts sewn together and brought back to life. What the fuck? It started to approach me, and I noticed it carry a small cage in its human hand, and inside that cage was Silas. He was not crying, just looking sad, as if he was used to this, but still unsatisfied. It put the cage down amongst all the other children. The air was oddly still and cold, filled with the sound of this thing's breathing and sprinkled with the excited whispers of the children.
Father's here! Father's here! Father's here!
They whispered excitedly, like it was their actual father, not some cryptid demon creature. My mouth was still bound by layers of thick duct tape, and I could do nothing more than make inaudible noises and screams. This goat man came straight up to me and started sniffing me like a dog. I almost threw up in my mouth due to the stench that was emanating from this thing. It spoke unnaturally, with pauses at odd points and tonal inflections that were wrong on every level, and with a deep, raspy, thunderous voice. Step forward. Miss Weatherby and my grandmother both approached the beast. It continued. Silas almost escaped. Again today, your insolence behooves me. Munoz was sufficient, but this will not do. This is the last man of my bloodline in existence. Besides Silas here, this sacrifice is insufficient. I should take another bloodline sacrifice for the night. Release the male. Mrs. Weatherby and my grandma looked at each other in confusion, but proceeded to do as they were instructed. They approached me and took the tape off of my mouth and untied the ropes I was bound by. Immediately, I took off running towards the woods, but before I had even got 10 feet, I was being pulled back with a force so strong it almost gave me whiplash. It was the tentacle on this beast that had wrapped around my waist and pulled me back. Where are you going? It thundered. I was speechless, and now paralyzed by fear, laying on the ground helplessly in front of this beast being held down by its tentacle arm. If you run away, I won't be as kind as I was to your little brother here. One male in captivity is enough. If you try to escape, my children will hunt you down and devour you in my name. Brother? He was talking about Silas. How was he my brother? I thought. but that thought quickly escaped my mind as I stared into the face of this monstrosity. It continued to speak.
I am a generous God, and I will let you live. However, you can tell no one what you saw. And so that you won't, you will deliver this year's sacrifice to me.
And as he said that, he gestured over to Mrs. Weatherby and my grandmother. My stomach dropped as I was still paralyzed from the sheer terror of this entire situation. I'd never killed anyone, nor had even thought about it. Even if I thought that these ladies deserved it, since they tied me up and tried to sacrifice me. The beast creature they referred to as father looked me straight into my eyes and growled.
Choose now.
I snapped out of my paralysis because I knew this beast could devour me and grind my bones with his razor-sharp canines extruding from its hideous snout. As I really thought about it, the decision was not that difficult. It came down to kill or be killed. I decided to kill. I grabbed Mrs. Weatherby and my piece of shit grandmother quite aggressively, took their torches and tied them to the stake. The children began singing loudly again, and Father walked up to the ladies and sniffed them.
This sacrifice is sufficient.
I threw the torch onto the pile of wood, and like a military-grade flamethrower, it burst into flames. Miss Weatherby and my grandmother both were shrieking in pain as the flames danced around their silhouettes and slowly melted the skin off their bones. It was bittersweet. Only a charred shell of what the women used to be was left as the flames died down. All of a sudden, two little girls that I'd never seen, both wearing porcelain animal masks, quietly walked out the woods and joined the other kids in the circle. One with a goat mask and one with a rabbit mask. The smell of burnt flesh filled the air, and I began to gag. The monstrosity called Father walked up to the burnt bodies and started devouring them like a ravenous animal. I watched in horror as all the kids began to sing in unison. Father stopped eating, looked up at me and said,
You have done well, my child. You may leave.
I looked at Silas still in the cage, who had a melancholy look on his face. This look kind of like he was crying out to me, like, take me with you. I couldn't just leave this kid stuck in this madness, especially since he was my brother. The fear and anger boiled up in that instance, making me yell, Father, Silas is my brother. May he come with me too? The beast took a long pause as his animal hybrid mouth dripped with blood and visceral matter, and said,
On one condition.
I now live at my grandmother's house, well, now my house, with Silas, and I have a new girlfriend. I met her about a year ago, and she's pregnant. She loves me for me, and she sees me as an adult. I can't wait for the baby. Everything is good now, but one thing is for certain. I will never be a substitute teacher again. And that's because I'm Daniel Jackson, headmaster at Alfred Weatherby Middle School.